Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. This is our podcast where we're going to try to overview the most important parts of the church sex abuse scandal. If you were going to listen one thing that we have to say on this issue, I think this podcast will have the most basics in it. We're going to try to overview how it initially broke in 2002, what the substance of it was, what the causes that led to the, creating structures of abuse, then some interesting figures within it, some reforms that were made to correct it, and then also we're going to review some other organizations that aren't formally part of the Catholic Church, but religious orders that had problems and how they handled it. Mm-hmm. How you doing, Laura Heeman?
Doing good.
What happened to your horse-themed studio?
I've tried to eliminate my sister's childhood wallpaper from our podcast, but I don't know. They could still show up.
Okay, good. Well, yeah. I hope so.
We'll see. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you and I, when did we decide we met?
2002. Fall 2002, I think.
Fall. Okay, so we met after the scandal had broken. So shortly after...
It was still fresh. It was still fresh. People were still talking about it. Things were still coming out.
In a sense, it still feels fresh right now, which is scary, But so in 2001, near the end, we had 9/11. And then not 4 or 5 months later, in February 2002, we have the Boston Globe breaking a series of articles that just rocked the whole Catholic Church in America, and eventually, I think, had influence outside of America. And the basics of the articles was that there were 6 priests currently serving in the Boston Archdiocese. How many priests would you guess are in Boston? I meant to try to look that up, but it's hard to get numbers like that.
I have no idea, but Boston historically had been a deeply Catholic city, yes. There were a lot of Catholics.
I wouldn't be surprised if the number was over 1,000 at some points, but probably in 2002 it was not as high as 1,000. But there were 6 people operating at that time that had enough evidence on them to be prosecuted if it was turned over. But the Catholic Church was not an automatic reporter. The cardinal and the structure who was running Boston, Cardinal Law, it wasn't by law that he had to turn all that evidence over. And so he'd been covering it up. At the end of the year of 2002, he resigns. He doesn't make it through 2002. He is brought given a job in Rome. And 2 things to know about that was there was a sense in the U.S. that he was going to Rome in order to escape prosecution by the U.S. government under even organized crime laws was one of the accusations. There was a sense apparently in Rome that there was a divided opinion whether or not he was being unfairly persecuted or not. And that's why he'd lost his bishopric. And it wasn't just these 6 priests who were the issue. The issue was there were accusations, not all proven in law, but just, evidence, some level of evidence of abuse going back 50 years worth of evidence, of many different priests, but only 6 that were serving actively. So, and there's also a sense in which this is
and
all
they weren't one-offs. There were a lot, a number of those accusations had been, many people abused by one priest.
So there was both the scandal of the priest having criminal behavior, and then there's also the scandal of the hierarchy of the church not directly shutting it down, and often transferring people to new locations so they could try to start again or have essentially a whole new group
facilitating more.
Yeah, inadvertently, that's just a complete facilitation of the abuse. So there also was a sense in which some people wanted to think of this as a Boston problem, but I think for reasons we're going to talk about, this was not really a Boston problem. Boston is where the stick of dynamite went off, but really it was a nationwide problem. And shortly thereafter, settlements happened across the nation, people trying to clean up this problem across the nation. I've got a list of causes for this. So this really shook me deeply at the time. I was thinking about priesthood. I was thinking about all types of things Catholic, and it shook me very badly. Here are some things that kind of came out. The hierarchy of the church had been treating pedophilia and any type of sexual deviance as a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd actually been sending people who'd been accused of it to counseling and
Mm-hmm.
as if they could be cured,
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds absolutely insane.
Yeah.
But apparently in the mental health field and in the church, it did not seem insane like as recent as the 80s.
Right. And I think a thing that came out was that Cardinal Law said, like in the 1993 or some in the early 90s, he said he instituted a policy to deal with, priests. And the policy was just like if a mental health official said, if mental health said they were fine to continue, then they could go. That was it. Like that was.
And I remember when we read the McCarrick report, it was kind of interesting because one of the guys who comes out looking good in the McCarrick report is Cardinal O'Connor in New York City. And he talks about trying to discipline McCarrick, who's not in his diocese, but over in Newark, and how a mental health official, doctor was like, well, this priest who's got this problem, it's really not his fault because of X, Y, Z. And Cardinal O'Connor's like, I don't really buy what he's writing in the letter, I don't really buy what this mental health official's saying. I don't really trust it,
Yeah.
And so certainly there's no problem it's just interesting because like if you treat this as like a sin that needs like stamped out or as unacceptable, that's the way it needs to be treated here. And it's not wrong to also listen to the mental health officials, but when you completely turn over, hey, we're going to let sexual predators keep operating as long as a mental health official says it's okay, crazy. All right.
Yeah.
Another issue in this was that the whole way of reviewing these, there was not a good process for reviewing these accusations. Like there wasn't like a little justice process for it.
Right.
To the extent there was any process at all that anyone got the accusations and did something with them, it was always priests. And it was always priests judging priests. And priests taking other priests' word for whether or not they'd really done it. So if it's like a he said, she said, well, one guy's a priest and I'm a priest and I know what it's like to be falsely accused or I've worried about that in the past, always take that guy's word for it. That was another cause of it. A huge cause of it that I probably should have said first was these types of problems are institutional problems. If you have a orphanage, a school, a hospital run by any group, the government, any religion, secular institute, you will have an abuser operate in there and you have to have systems to get them out.
Right.
And one of the problems of the Catholic Church is there is no group that ran more institutions than the Catholic Church, at least in the U.S. in the last century.
No, there's not.
Only the government has operated as many institutions or more than the Catholic Church. And some of these institutions are half government, half church.
I don't think anybody has had more hospitals, more orphanages, more anything than the Catholic Church. Like
schools alone. No one's had as many schools, right?
Right.
And these are all kind of places where scandal happens, right? So
outside of the Catholic Church as well.
Right. And definitely outside of the Catholic Church. Public school districts have the same problem the Catholic Church is having. But you almost feel like the Catholic Church should have known better or had better processes for getting people out. I really think the issue here is a process issue. At least part of the issue is. All right. Another cause was they were transferring people. Therefore, local communities couldn't build cases and get people out, because you keep switching their local community and they get a chance to start over. Another part of the cause of the problem is there's just a certain percent of the population that has this kind of sexual deviance. We talked before, it's between 1% and 5%. No one knows for sure, but even 1% is quite high, And we haven't been able to show that this exists in any higher percentage historically in the priesthood than it exists any other place in society.
Right. It should exist lower in the priesthood.
It should exist lower. Right.
Yeah.
But we definitely don't have evidence of that.
Yeah. But, and apart from the faith reasons, it's like, we do psych evaluations when guys go into the seminary, and anyway.
Those psych evaluations can be very thorough, particularly now. I wonder what they were like in the 80s and 70s.
Yeah. Right.
Also don't know. It also appears that part of the problem was the state of the mental health, I don't know what you call it, industry or what, was also poorly understanding this phenomena. Yeah, the field was not properly understanding the phenomena either because they thought they could treat it and cure it.
Right.
So, so I don't know how useful your evaluations are going to be if that's one of your premises.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
Another issue why it seemed so big was I think the church very wrongly, instead of letting scandal happen as it happened, instead of being like, oh, we have this bad priest, it's 1965. Oh, we have another
Mm-hmm.
bad priest, happens to be 1970 now. Instead, this is all the dirty laundry of half a century in Boston getting dumped,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
including dirty laundry of priests who are dead,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff outside the statute of limitations, a lot of stuff that, was made by bishops who weren't even cardinal law. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like he'd
Yeah.
been bishop for nearly 50 years in Boston. Um, so it's 50 years of scandal all at once. And the last thing I have on my list to mention is the church is founded with a little bit of a familial ideal. There's kind of
Yeah.
like the priest as father figure, and also it's also like a family in the sense that, like, if your brother or father or whoever in your family or uncle is a sexual predator, you can't like fire your uncle,
Mm-hmm.
you know. I think that this scandal raises the question whether or not we need to be able to fire our uncle. But
Yeah.
that is kind of was the norm in the church, was to view it like, if you have someone in the hierarchy that has a problem, or a priest who has a problem, they're still a priest, and we're kind of waiting for them to die. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the way we get rid of the
Right.
problem
Right.
is
Right.
we contain it and let it die with them. But
Yeah.
really that's not what's happening. What's happening is they're still successfully abusing people, and there's a correlation between being abused and becoming an abuser, which is a very
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate,
Mm-hmm.
sad correlation. So they're
Yeah.
actually causing the problem. It's just horrible. So I kind of think that churches that are less hierarchical will have less problems like this. Well, they'll still have predators, but they won't
It's
have.
the cover up was like the
Yes, that part of the
yeah.
scandal you can't have if you're just
Yeah.
small
I
church that's
yeah.
independent.
Right. I had two thoughts about covering the abuse and like kind of mental health stuff. It used to be if you had somebody with a mental health issue in your family, you would like hide it, right?
Right.
And now I think we're understanding better and better if like someone has a mental health issue, you tell everyone about it and everyone knows how to
Yes. Yes. You don't say the person's a bit strange, or you don't say the
right.
person. Yeah, you don't have
You
these
don't
like
keep
kind
them
of
locked up in your
euphemisms.
house. Yeah.
But I also noticed this like in parenting. Like, my mom was talking to my wife and I, and it's like in my mom's generation, if you said, "Ma'am, I think something is wrong with your child," the parent would be like, "No, there's not. How dare you tell me that?" Like, if I would have come home and the teacher would have said, "I think there's a problem with Clark. He doesn't pay attention," or something like that. She's
yeah.
like, "There's not a problem with Clark." And then she'd like, whip me into shape, and try to
Right.
send me back.
Right.
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 And in today's world, you have parents who you meet them, and within uh, the first, 10 minutes of conversation, they've already told you every diagnosis their child has.
Yeah.
It's a very different mental health attitude.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And maybe an overcorrection.
Yeah, maybe an overcorrection, right?
Right.
Because I hate that, because it's like then you start prejudging the child. It's like you start looking at the child as diagnosis, like everything they're doing. Is that because he has ADHD, or is that because he has, as opposed
Yeah,
to just being
yeah.
a person?
Right, right. Another idea I have is that you said, there wasn't like a process for dealing with this. There wasn't like, okay, you report it to this person and then they go to, there wasn't like every bishop was just kind of like, what do I do?
Right.
And, but something that made it weird is bishops were worried about, trampling the rights of the priest or something, or what if it was a false accusation, or and when I've heard people talk about this, I feel like they're sort of mixing like, the U.S. criminal justice with like how the church works. And I don't want innocent priests to get trampled, But there's another thing that's like the priest is like married to the church. That's the image we have, and it's like the priest is sacrificing his life for the church, and it's not the rights of the priest, are not like, don't trump that somehow, I don't know. Do you get what I'm saying?
I think I know what you're saying. I feel like it's like, if the church came to you and said, what would be best, they could say, it's not your fault. We think this could be a false accusation, but what's best for the church is that you go be a monk or a hermit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if you really were dedicated to serving the church, you'd be like, okay, you're right. I mean, there's this accusation out against me. I need to go into complete sequestered retirement. You know what I mean? Like I cannot keep operating, or I got to go get a different job or something like this, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like instead, it's more like, no, I have a right to be a priest.
Right. And it's like, wait, what? No.
Yeah, I know. It's like, that's not what the whole idea was. That's not the servant idea.
Exactly. And what I really want is like for the truth to come into the light, right? And whatever it is what I really want. I also want the priest to be willing to do whatever for the church and her people, because that's what they have signed up for.
Yeah. So let's talk about two figures that kind of, to me, played a big role at this time. One was George Weigel, a big Catholic thinker, and the other one's Benedict Groeschel. So Benedict Groeschel at this time, I think, had a pretty popular TV show. He was the founder of the Capuchin Friars, the Renewal up in New York City. He also was a PhD in psychology. Does that sound right? Is it psychiatry or psychology? I think it was psychology from Columbia. And he also was running like a treatment facility, or he was working at a treatment facility for priests with problems.
Right.
And had worked with some of these guys. Right.
Yeah.
And he does not seem to think it was like a curable thing. He never acted like this ever should have happened in any way. But what he said was, yeah, this is a problem. And it's not a problem just in Boston. He made it very clear in his show that this is a nationwide thing. And that when bishops get appointed, it's like kind of a horror to them that they kind of inherit this problem from the previous bishop, Right. And the other story I heard that confirmed that was, I know a diocese that essentially knew that this was a problem. And the finance officer of the diocese came forward and said, guys, this is a huge problem. I can't believe this has never been dealt with. We are totally open to this huge liability. Yeah. We actually need to save money because we're going to get sued, And they did. And when Boston broke, that diocese just got all the victims together, said, we're sorry. They just went to resolve the problem immediately and actually probably resolved it quicker, better, cheaper than, not that the whole point's to be cheap, but they were able to handle it because they just saw it coming down the pipe. So apparently there was like this attitude within the church that they knew there was a historical wrong. They knew it needed corrected. They didn't know what to do. And then Boston kind of brought it out in the open and let them address it. You know? Weigel was interesting to me because I was going to the Catholic Information Center in downtown DC at the time. This is before Simple House. And Weigel would just be a person in the audience. The audience would often be like 15, 20 people. Weigel was very famous even then for having written the biography of John Paul II. And he would it'd be always interesting to me once I figured out who he was. Like he'd just ask a question of the speaker. One time he actually gave the talk. And I remember the time he gave the talk, I believe it was also 2002. The Vatican knew Weigel. John Paul II knew Weigel. And called him back to Rome, said, please come to Rome and talk to us about this. And by the time the Vatican had called him to Rome, the scandal had already broken for like 4 or 5 or 6 months, Yeah. And when Weigel came back and talked at the Catholic Information Center, he said, the Vatican, you have to understand, operates slower than the rest of the world. They're about 6 months behind the news. And he goes, and they let the news kind of settle for 6 months before they worry about it. But then he goes, but when they want to, they can get up to date fast. And he goes, and that's why I was called in, was to help tell them what a big problem this was and that they needed to get up to date. And he said, and when they get up to date, they get 3 days behind the news. They're never really on top of it, but they're almost on top of it. Right. And I thought that was interesting too. And I could tell, from other things that it really, was rough on his faith that this whole thing had happened. I admire the way he handled that whole thing. Another interesting person is Sean O'Malley. So Sean O'Malley is another Capuchin. Another Capuchin, not a Capuchin Friar of the Renewal, but just a standard Capuchin, Sean O'Malley. So he becomes bishop. And he gets put in charge of Palm Beach. And the Palm Beach scandal, I think, might have broke a little bit before Boston, but this wasn't given as much play. And in Palm Beach, actually, the bishops themselves had been accused of doing things wrong. I also remember at this time that the Bishop of Palm Beach, this is just from my memory, I couldn't find it on research, but they had this big Miami-style mansion they were building in Palm Beach for the bishop.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It's like back from the days of like cardinal princes and little castles and things like that, right? So it was like, not only is he being accused of a crime, he also looks like
Yeah.
a televangelist with this house he's building, So Sean O'Malley went down there, cleaned that up to I'm not sure exactly what he did, but he was sent there to solve the problem. And then he was made bishop in Boston and later cardinal to solve the problem. And even today seems to be the point man from the Vatican for addressing the problem in the U.S.,
Right.
And I don't know how he's viewed in Boston, but I view him very positively from where I am here.
Yeah. Here.
Let's talk about how the church addressed this then. So there's a difficulty in addressing these things in the church because the church is actually a group of dioceses. And the dioceses are fairly independent. Like it looks from the outside to be very hierarchical that, a bishop reports to an archbishop who reports to a cardinal who reports to the pope or whatever. This is way less formal than it sounds.
Yeah, I mean, there might be like sort of like levels of being in charge of things, but there's not really like an upward reporting to,
There's a lot of soft power and not a whole lot of hard power with that. There's a lot of persuasion and you should follow the guy's lead, but not a lot of clear ways. Like if a bishop doesn't want to promulgate something or participate in something that the USCCB wants to do, they just don't have to because that USCCB doesn't have official standing to force them to do things. Right. It's a voluntary type thing. So having a universal policy is difficult. Like at the end of the day, you can issue guidelines, but they have to be adopted at a diocesan level. The guidelines that seem to have been adopted across the U.S. are stop listening to the mental health experts. Rome ordered a reform of the seminaries. They wanted to have better sexual education in the seminaries about a healthy celibate sexuality. They also wanted to get rid of homosexual subcultures that were causing scandal. They also created a more or less zero tolerance policy. So the zero tolerance policy, I think, has two parts. If a accusation comes in, it first has to be judged to be credible. Like, and credible is a very low bar, and it's not defined anywhere totally, but I took it as possible.
Yeah.
Like if you say,
I think so, yeah.
This happened to me in 1999, and the guy wasn't even a priest in 1999, then it's not credible.
Yeah.
But like if he was a priest, and you can at some level put the two people at the same place, so all of a sudden it's credible.
Yeah. I remember people like being worried about whether this was fair or not.
Yeah. It's probably not totally fair, but it was maybe necessary, as weird as that sounds.
Yeah.
We need to talk about false accusations in a minute, but
yeah.
So
I mean, I feel like who cares if it's fair?
I think you've made your case for that already, so that's good. Who cares if it's fair? All right. Yeah. Zero tolerance. All right. So
I tell my kids that too.
So the zero tolerance policy. Part of it is if it's credible, and once it's credible, you completely disclose it, which helps other victims come forward. You disclose it to the police. You just complete disclosure. Yeah. And usually the priest is removed. Not transferred, but removed. Yeah. So there's kind of a go to police first policy. And this
removed from ministry, not like removed from the priesthood automatically.
That's right.
Removed
from
it's
ministry. Not enough to take away priesthood to have a credible accusation, but it's enough to be removed from ministry. Yeah. And this disclosure is so aggressive that I know that this is true in Missouri, in the 5 dioceses in Missouri, and I think it's largely true nationwide, that basically they've been disclosing everything, even things far outside the statute of limitations where there's no role the police would have in prosecuting anything. I know in St. Louis, they had the Attorney General of Missouri was just allowed to come in and inspect anything they wanted, even though there were they knew there were no laws violated. It was like maybe a law was violated 40 years ago, or that's no longer, maybe the guy's dead, nothing could happen, but they still disclosed it all and invited review of it. The other big reform that I think is really important is they put lay people in the process of judging what happened. So like in my diocese, there's an ombudsman number to call.
Right.
they also want groups of lay people reviewing the evidence. They don't want
Mm-hmm.
it with priests. So now there's a
Mm-hmm.
real process to process the accusations.
One thing they wanted on the board for some of the people to be like there was something like it had to have 5 like practicing Catholics on the review board, but it didn't have to be all practicing Catholics was
Oh,
an
right. So
interesting
even
thing.
people
Yeah.
outside the church, which is
Mm-hmm.
important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There already was some training happening within the church for helping
Mm-hmm.
parents like look out for these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that training was just copycatting what was happening outside the church. It wasn't like the Catholic Church was leading the way on that. But then
Mm-hmm.
after this process, I think that became all the more necessary and serious after the scandal
Yes.
that we
Yeah.
are giving parents and Catholic schools and safe, what do they call it? Like safe, like you have to have a certificate in our diocese before you can
Yeah.
work with children that you've been through a certain
Yeah.
amount of training.
Right. In the Archdiocese in DC, it's called the Virtus training. But so they have different names in different dioceses.
Yep.
And it's like you want to do any church related thing with a child, you have
Virtus
to
training.
have yeah.
Yes. So, all right. And I think that's most of the reform. So just to summarize that, no longer the mental health experts in charge, reform of the seminaries, a zero tolerance policy that has to do with full disclosure publicly into the police, and also just credible is enough. It doesn't have to reach some super high level of proof. And lay people in the reporting process, judging process, and training for the laity to look for the signs. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. You wanted to say something about false accusations?
I'd like to start that with, there's this parable of the wheat and the tares in the New Testament where they say the sower goes out and sows wheat, and then the people come back and they go, hey, we've noticed some weeds within the wheat. Do you want us to go pull the weeds? And God, who's the sower, is like, no, because if you pull the weeds, some of the wheat will come up with it, and therefore you're going to wait until we let everything grow up tall, and then we're going to harvest and separate the weeds and the wheat and burn essentially send the weeds to hell is kind of the imagery used there, right? Burn the weeds and keep the wheat. And I think that's like very meaningful here is that if we are trying to pull all the weeds out, which we are at this point, trying to pull all the weeds out of the church, there will be wheat pulled up. There will be people who are innocent who go down on this, and I think I've met people who hated the church so much and hated priests so much, they would gladly take down a priest or believe anything. I've seen women who literally are batting their eyes at priests as if they're trying to make moves on them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
And like if one of them is scorned, I don't know what they would do. I don't think they're that mentally stable, and churches are places also for people who aren't mentally stable, so not kicking these people out of the church,
Right.
And then there's also this issue of, I work with both of us have worked with a lot of seminarians, and these guys are future priests. Like probably less than half of the seminarians we work with become priests. Like there's a lot of people who don't make it through seminary by their own choice or by the choice of the seminary. But some of them are very naive. Some of them flirt, but maybe don't think they're flirting.
Right.
Some of them, they're just kind of stupid in some ways. And some of them are getting weeded out and some of them aren't. But they're not guilty.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're just... And some of those guys are going to go down too. And you can claim it's a little bit their fault, but not everyone's got it all together when it comes to all their social skills,
Yeah. Yeah.
So far, we've reviewed the substance of the scandal. We reviewed some interesting characters within it and the causes. Then we reviewed the reforms that were made, and we talked about the problem of false accusation. So the related scandal to this is that there are Catholic things that are not the church. Simple House is one of them. Like we are a Catholic organization, but we are not part of the Catholic Church in any formal way. We're a 501c3, and there's Catholics here, right? There's also Catholic hospitals that are in that status, but also all these religious orders are in that status. So a religious order for people outside the church, and people who really know their canon law are going to think I'm butchering this, but essentially it's a group, it's a club, it's a group of people who are trying to do something of religious orientation, but it's not a parish, it's not a church, it's not from the bishop, it's not from the priest usually. They organize, They end up getting recognized by the diocese at some point. Like, this is not saying Simple House goes through, because we're not trying to become a religious order. We're just like, the most we get recognized by the diocese is they might give us a grant to do some work at some point. Or the bishop will come over and say hi, bless the house, but that's it. There's no formal hierarchical structure of control the way you'd think of in a firm or a company.
Right.
So the religious order grows. It kind of goes from a club to a diocesan level to a multi-diocese level. So it's in multiple cities working with different bishops. And then the ultimate level it can never get to is pontifical right, which means that the Vatican says that bishops can't push it around, and it has certain legal protections within canon law. And within this whole process, you need sponsors, meaning you need bishops who say, I like this group. I put my name with this group. My reputation's at stake in this group. I'm for this group, right? So that's what these institutes are. So this is a little bit different.
The church is purposefully slow approving. It's not like, okay, 1 or 2 years. It's like, groups might exist for decades, before.
Right. The story of St. Francis going to the Pope and getting the Franciscans recognized and their rule recognized is totally abnormal in the history of the church. That's not the way this rolls usually. But that order also grew to 10,000 people in St. Francis's lifetime, which is also totally abnormal.
Right.
Let's review 3 groups that had a major scandal. So we can't blame all this on the bishops, okay? Can't blame this on the church directly, but they are Catholic groups that had their own problems. Let's talk about what caused it, how you could identify it, what happened. We're going to go over the Institute of the Incarnate Word, the Legionnaires, and L'Arche. Institute of the Incarnate Word. The founder sexually harassed seminarians, essentially, adults, right. But used his authority to harass them. They also were kind of weird in the sense of which sponsors they had. The Carrick became a protector and sponsor them, and he's now not even a cardinal anymore or a priest because of scandal that he did himself, not scandal he was covering up. They also were very accepting of Cardinal Law after he'd been banished from Boston. I think we know that firsthand from something you saw.
Yeah. I mean, I had spent some time with them, and they, not as a part of the order, but I was with them when they hosted Cardinal Law, and they were so excited he was coming. It was so bizarre. But they their understanding was that he had been persecuted by the media. That was their view. Was there
any nuance in that? How do you say he was shuffling around pedophile priests, but it was just a persecution? Do they say oh, he was guilty, but it really isn't as bad as it sounds, or what was this? Or he's completely innocent,
say,
or what?
There was no nuance.
What would have happened if you would at that moment have told, maybe not Cardinal Law, but one of the sisters, I think it's really wrong what he did, and he's not innocent?
Somebody did. There was one of the sisters' moms was visiting, and she's like, "This is a load of crap." And it was it wasn't the room. It wasn't like a room full of sisters. It was just a few, and it was kind of nobody answered, and
because there is no answer.
Right, there is no answer.
It's kind of an emperor has no clothes situation, right?
Yeah, and I think there may have been a thing where it's maybe a more nuanced person in the order could say something like, this was terrible, he acted badly. Also, there was some media persecution, right? I'm not, sure. Maybe somebody, and then maybe less talented people in the order ran with that idea. I think that could have been a thing that happened sometimes, I think the more talented and gifted people in the order are loaded with responsibilities and weren't always the talking pieces, I think that was a thing that happened. But yeah, so you have all these sisters without nuance saying, oh, Cardinal Law was persecuted by the media. And it's unfair, and we're so happy he's here. He's such a holy man, Yeah.
I've been wondering if I should say this, but we have a mutual friend who talked about having a phone meeting with Cardinal Law way back in the day and bringing up a priest that was misbehaving. The person never told us how the priest was misbehaving. And Cardinal Law kind of yelled over the phone at her. It was and this is a forceful woman. This is not some person to be cowed by even Cardinal Law.
Right.
but yelled basically, "That's not your problem. That's not your job to be telling me how to handle this or whatever," right?
Yeah.
And it made me think, what the person I think was saying with that story was Cardinal Law was toxic.
Yeah.
He wasn't like a meek mannered guy who this had happened to, who was trying to do his best. But he was a pretty toxic guy who was heavy handed on some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so given all that, so this institute is still around. Their founder has been gone. And I think all of these groups, the founder's gone, and there some level of purging happened. I don't even know what level, like as far as like the writings can't be used now, right? Because this person was off track.
I think they do.
That's so wrong to me.
Yeah.
I don't feel like going into the Institute of the Incarnate Word right now, because the same problems with the Legionnaires, and we need to get through this, but
yeah,
we got to talk about that, about whether or not, what level of purge should happen when this stuff gets revealed.
Yeah.
Should we move on, or did you want to issue some highlights off that? Because you knew that order better than I did.
Yeah, so I feel a little bit bad talking about this because I have friends in the order, and I think they are experiencing some fruit being in the order. But a thing that was weird about the founder was that there was this whole narrative about him being persecuted because he was so holy. And anytime there was like anything like the church was worried about his behavior, it was like the church in Argentina is so liberal and they kicked him out of the seminary because he was too orthodox and he's just misunderstood and it's a persecution. And anytime anyone brought up his name, it was like, oh, Padre Abuela, he's such a holy man, he's persecuted, Right. And
therefore that's already putting an accuser on the back foot. They become a persecutor.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Now I'm like, if you tell me somebody is persecuted, I'm like, like that's like already red flag, And I think we've seen this in other, we'll talk about the legionaries, but so it was interesting that they had this narrative with Cardinal Law because it was the same thing they had with their founder. And
there's also a similar narrative in the legionaries. Another thing that's also true, and we're going to get to the legionaries in a second, was that this order was growing by leaps and bounds, looking very successful and very healthy when Catholic orders were really suffering.
Yeah.
When orders were closing. So
yeah,
they're exploding in growth, and they're very proud of that. I felt like it was like idealized growth. It's like at some level, like if you're at a simple house or at any type of startup or whatever, you got to kind of come to the fact that you may never grow. And if you're doing what's right, it's okay.
Yeah.
You just need to do it anyway,
Yeah.
But you don't need the growth as proof that you're on the right track necessarily.
Right. And so they were using growth as like, see, like, this is
right.
As proof,
and then,
exactly.
And so were the legionnaires. So the legionnaires were famous throughout the 90s and early 2000s of sending out these letters that were like, we have 5,000 men in formation, 500 people ordained. And I remember going to another vocation director from another order, and I said, man, I just got this letter from the legionnaires, and this other order was suffering. And he goes, did it say they had 5,000 and 500? Did it say they're JP2's favorite order?
Like, right, yeah.
Right? And I go, it did. And he goes, yeah, they've been saying that a long time. I'm wondering when they're going to update their numbers.
Yeah.
It's like for a decade, they'd been sending out the same letter with the same exact number of seminarians. So they were saying about that at the time I was kind of young and I didn't realize this older priest was warning me with that statement, Yeah.
Well, there was a thing about the, I don't remember the details of this, but it was like JP2 said like one nice thing to the founder one time. Right. And it was like they ran with it. And I think that's like another red flag,
Right.
Yeah.
And I also went into a retreat center they were running outside DC one time, and I didn't think I even knew it was being run. I don't remember why I went there, but it wouldn't have been abnormal for me to walk into a Catholic retreat center to just ask questions. And I met a legionnaire, right? Mm-hmm. And somehow in that process, unbeknownst to me, my name was recorded.
Ooh,
and I started getting phone calls from the legionnaires. And they were running phone banks of seminarians.
Oh my gosh.
And the phone calls went on for years.
Yeah.
And other young guys I knew were having the same issue, right? And then when you met the young legionnaires, it was really weird, but like I went to this other guy and he and I had both met the young Legionnaires, but not together, just total separate observations. And when I met him, I go, you can't see what I'm doing. I'm like taking my hand across my head and swooping it over. And it was just this weird statement of they all part their hair the same way, because they literally all part their hair the same way.
Yeah.
Like as if it's like part of the training. Here's how you comb your hair. You will part your hair this way. Right.
Yeah.
There was something cultish about it. And as time went on, that kind of, I didn't have as many run-ins with the seminarians or anything. It wasn't a big part of my life, but I started kind of looking at things online a little bit, and accusations were coming out against the founder long before the church took him seriously, I felt like.
Yeah.
And the accusations were along the lines of sexual harassment of seminarians.
Yeah.
Right? Like he was abusing seminarians.
Yeah, I want to say another thing that was happening is, so they have they're associated with Regnum Christi, which is like a lay
group they started.
Yeah.
A lay group they started.
Yeah. And so the first time I heard about the Legionnaires, it was like I had met a guy in college that was like super, I didn't know about them, but he had like kind of he had stopped being involved with these priests on a bad note. That was, I realized in retrospect that's who they were, and I asked him about it. And then I had another friend whose little brother, same exact thing, and right. I felt like all through my 20s I was meeting like Catholics that had been kind of burnt by Regnum Christi.
Right.
So, and it was like, oh, they left Regnum Christi. Oh, they were in Regnum Christi. They also left, and
I'd also heard of people coming out of the order and needing to go into like mental hospitals and things.
Yeah.
Which you don't know if they had that problem when they went in or if the order caused the problem.
Yeah.
But there was something, both of these orders are from Latin America. Like one is from Argentina. The Institute Incarnate Word, and the Legionnaires are from Mexico.
Okay, Mexico, yeah.
And so when I went down the internet rabbit hole on accusation was before the fall of the founder. And the accusations, it was like all kind of had a pattern. It was like all guys who'd been in seminary in Mexico, and there was like more than a couple. There was like a dozen or something like this, right? I think I actually didn't research this, but I think it goes well beyond that. But and they were all like, he came to my room one night and made a pass at me. And some of them, sometimes the pass was successful, sometimes not, or whatever. I don't know what successful means. Sometimes he abused, sometimes the person escaped. But what was interesting about it was the online discussion of these things, like in comments and things, were along the lines of, our founder is so holy. He has taken a special vow not to defend himself against accusations. Therefore, all these people can make accusations, and he doesn't come out and acknowledge and refute them and blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, when there's like 12 people online accusing you of something, something needs done,
Yeah.
And then I remember, so then he takes the fall with Pope Benedict. It's one of the kind of early in Pope Benedict's, JP2 dies, Pope Benedict becomes Pope, and he almost immediately starts calling into question the founder of the Legionnaires.
Right.
And it turns out he's got a family.
Yeah.
Like he's not just kind of going after male seminarians. He has a woman that he's like got a secret family with, I think in Italy. And that ends his, he's now out, the Pope shut him down, and when that happened, I remembered seeing online, I went and revisited the places where I'd seen the accusations before. And I was seeing discussions like, I'm so sorry. We were like in denial. We all said you accusers were lying, but now we realize that we were wrong. But within 2 months, they'd gone right back to, we actually think it's a lie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was like just clear that there's some mental problem happening here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some
and
cultish
I think that's
problem.
another red flag is when you see people have like a devotion to a certain priest or a founder or something that's like,
right. And since he left, I remember they've tried to reform that order and save it, although I think many, many people have been leaving the Legionnaires. But there's still talk today that they've never really reformed. That like the Pope, even Pope Francis put out a statement in 2020, like 10 years after, saying, the order is not successfully reformed from these problems. I really don't understand. I'm going to go into my big critique that they need to refound these orders and start over. But I don't see how you can successfully reform totally. Like if you came to that order because you were attracted to the ideas of the founder,
Yeah.
I mean, some of those ideas are fine, I'm sure,
Yeah.
but like something is a deep rooted problem in that spiritual life, and it's very hard to pull it away, the good from the bad.
Yeah. I think a thing that was attractive to people about both of those orders is like they felt like there was like a lot of relativism in the world and in theology. And here was an order that was like committed to the truth.
I think that those orders were almost more anti-liberal than they were Catholic.
Hmm.
Well, actually, I don't know about the Institute Incarnate Word. I think the Legionnaires were. But they were much
Yeah, I
more kind of
wouldn't.
rejection of the relativism of the modern world than they were, I felt like,
No,
deeply Catholic.
I think like the Institute of the Incarnate Word has a real love for the church and the Eucharist and Mary.
One of the things
Yeah.
we do need to avoid, though, is judging people and judging
Yeah.
the good and the bad carefully. Like what we're looking for here is, what are the institutional problems? How do you call a spade a spade? How do you identify when a whole order has got a problem and is not healthy? Right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Right. And I think this is important to me. I felt conflicted about talking about the Institute of the Incarnate Word because I have a complicated relationship with them, I guess. But I have like some amount of good feelings towards them. But I also had a traumatic thing happen when I spent time with it. Was like very like manipulative, certain people in the order. And I think if I would have been able to identify, like if I had heard somebody talking about red flags or like identifying, well, this is like a weird way to act
Right.
or something, I would not.
You would have pulled up and not crashed the plane as hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about this, because another group is L'Arche, right? And they're definitely a group that a lot of people have had really positive experiences with and still do probably. But they're complicated in the same way you're trying to refer to the Institute of the Incarnate Word. So L'Arche is a community that lives with severely disabled people, and they live with them in radical equality, where it's like they're all members, they all vote, they all decide, but there's like people who live there just to be with the people who have disabilities, and then they're called core members, I believe, the disabled people who get to live in the house, right?
Yeah. There are
And they form
various levels
community.
of disability, by the way. The core members, it's fairly wide ranging. But
Okay. I've only seen, I guess, the more disabled.
Okay. And there are not many places where like a disabled adult can go and like live in a like sort of familial way. And
Way better
I
than
think,
what you'd think of as a normal group home.
yeah.
Right.
It is, yeah.
And I think it started out of France and has been
No,
big in the U.S.
he's Canadian. He's French
Canadian, though,
Yeah.
right? Yep. Okay, yep. So it's been a great movement within the church, and the founder was just like producing books all the time.
Jean Vanier.
All his books felt the same to me, in the sense that I never really liked them. They seemed like they were very over the top sympathy, empathy, type of spirituality, which kind of makes sense, given what they do. But it just didn't seem like they were very balanced. But I can't claim that I could have called that there was corruption or something.
I remember like 10 years ago at a book club, we read Befriending the Stranger by Jean Vanier, and there were people in the room that were like, this book changed my life. And I remember you being like, but it wasn't ever like, this guy's a weirdo, right?
I always found it kind of lame somehow, and I couldn't quite figure out. Like, it was very kind of like appealed to a certain type of spirituality and doubled down on it, like without tempering it, So what the scandal here is that Jean Vanier and his spiritual director would both take advantage of women who were seeking spiritual help and were looking up to them, and they would use God essentially as an excuse to be abusing these women, or if you want to call it sexual harassment, because it's all adults. But this happened fairly recently. Like, this movement been going on for a long time before the scandal hit.
Yeah.
Right. And what's kind of interesting to include here is the Institute of the Incarnate Word and the Legionnaires are what, like, if you're an inside baseball Catholic, you'd be like, those are kind of conservative groups, And the L'Arche, you'd say, is kind of a liberal group. So it's kind of like both sides of the aisle are having the same type of problems, They did not have idealized growth, I felt like. I felt like it was much more an idealized, like, look at how much we are, loving these people, you know.
I think the movement was really beautiful. Is like really beautiful. So it's I think like the L'Arche houses are awesome, and I know I talked to a person that used to live at one of the houses, and it seems like a lot of the internal discussion has been like, how do we, does this negate all the work and understanding, is the founder different from the movement? Is the movement the people that carry it out,
I've met people who went to those houses and were a little bit disturbed by the way they operated, but not in a way that made it super immoral. It was just like, they felt like the way group meetings were done was a little bit manipulated or whatever. But
oh, interesting.
Of course, I mean, you could say it about Simple House or anything, so I don't know that that proves anything. But
the houses were not like facilitating abuse. Like that was, they weren't set up.
There's no accusation of that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in two of these cases, I think we could say there was almost like a cult-like atmosphere. In the L'Arche case, maybe also, because they definitely idealized the founder. In all of these cases, I know people who still want to read the writings of these founders, even though they were, deeply flawed and should not be spiritual guides, So let's talk about this. So where I get hung up on this is there's always going to be a certain level of corruption and scandal, right? It's really bad when that scandal is in your roots, in your founding. Right. And I think I don't understand why these orders have not been refounded. And because I understand why, if you've been in an order 10 years, you've had a good experience, you have friends in the order, maybe you like the ministry you're doing, you're running an after school program or working in an orphanage or whatever, and you see it as important, and it is important. And then your founder gets, exposed, and I could see why you'd be like, well, maybe I don't want to read his writings anymore. Maybe I'm not going to talk great about him anymore. But I'm going to stay in this order, because what I do think this is where my friends are. I've already got 10 years invested, blah, 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 blah. Right.
Yeah. And you felt called to the particular order, the particular ministry.
I also see why some people would leave and feel deeply deceived and be pissed off. And I think they have a right to be. So what I don't get, though, is like, to me, the move is you take the best person in the order, put them with an outsider like a cardinal that's entrusted to reform the order, and then have them go through all the founding documents and essentially take all the tenets that seemed like the main tenets that were healthy and attracted people, rewrite the documents, rewrite a new founding book about what we're all about, change the name, probably change the habit, and in a sense, rebrand, refound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then it's like, this is a new way of doing things. We're breaking from the old way. And part of me with this is like, a tree by its fruits, which is very difficult with this because it's like, well, L'Arche seems like it has good fruit, but it's like, so does that mean John Vanier is good? We don't want to like judge people, but like, certainly he was not a good spiritual guide. I know that for a fact. Okay. So, but the organization he founded seems to be bearing fruit. So, I just don't see what's wrong with the rebranding idea. Like that seems to me like it's a win for everyone in the order. They get to stay with their friends. They get to stay doing most of the work they're doing, but there's going to be a new type of formation, a new type of retreat, a new type of teaching.
I think, we knew someone that entered a religious order, had a really bad experience, and then the order disbanded. I don't want to say his name.
Yes, I do remember. Yep.
Okay.
All right.
But it was like the Vatican decided that like the order was kind of like the fruit was too rotten to save any of it,
I don't know how that works because like if we're talking about the same situation, the founder there got in trouble not for like sexual issues, but for like maybe I think trying to manipulate people and forcing people to confess things and things like that, like being not good spiritual leader. And I think they removed that person, took away privileges of the order. Then members of the order got together and lived somewhere for a minute and decided if they could reform or save it. And then I think they decided no, and they all went separate directions. Okay. Right. So in a sense, it's not like the bishop said, you're over. Yeah. And I'm not sure the bishop can say that because it is just a group of private citizens. The bishop could say, get out of my building you're using or whatever. He can take away privileges, but I don't think he can just say you're over,
Yeah. Okay.
So in that case, probably so many people left, there was nothing left to save.
Okay.
You know,
I had understood that with the Legionaries and with the IVE, there was like a Vatican investigation, and it was, well, I don't know. With the Legionaries, I thought they were sort of deemed salvageable. Like there was enough there. There was enough there.
well, there's been multiple stories that the Vatican says they have not successfully reformed, and that they're resistant to successful reform. So,
Yeah.
To me, like doing an investigation, you 100% could do. Like I can do an investigation of the Legionaries. I can publish whatever I want, right? But having the power to force people to disband, I don't know where you have that.
With IVE, the Vatican forbade the founder from having contact with the order.
I think it's still soft power, maybe. It might be like, well, you'll lose a whole bunch of privileges. We're not going to ordain any guys and stuff like that.
I think they gave him some sort of rules he had to follow. He flouted them, and then there was a more hard. So right, like what binding? It's like not like legal, I guess, but.
So what's your problem though? When Webb mentioned before that these orders need essentially destroyed or rebranded, what's your problem with that idea? Like let's say L'Arche is one that neither of us is not as personal.
Do you think any of the members were answering real calls?
Sure.
And I think the answer is yes.
I said yes, but I don't think my understanding of that question is the same as yours, right? Like Napoleon went through Europe opening up monasteries and sending the monks home. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Did any of those monks have real calls? Yes. Did they have to go home? Probably. You know what I mean? So I don't know what that means, So let's talk this through. So let's take L'Arche, because Institute Incarnate Word, you have a lot of friends in that one, and there could be like other things that confuse that, make it harder to see. Let's take like one that is a little bit at arm's distance from both of us, L'Arche. What if L'Arche changed its name to the Ark or Beauty House or whatever you want to call it? You know what I mean, right? And they took John Vanier's books off the shelves.
Yeah.
Right. But instead they had whoever the leader is currently salvage most of John Vanier's best thought that they thought was the best that most of them were attracted to, and issue a new book called The Core Principles of Friendship House or whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? Right. And it's this new book that could be used for formation and stuff, but it's kind of been gone through a process of vetting. So we're not, because I don't see how they can keep reading his books knowing how he spiritually manipulates.
Yeah.
So knowing that he was predatorial like that, I don't know how you read his stuff for inspiration. So they're going to need new documents for inspiration. And if they don't need new documents for inspiration, I'm really for shutting them down, because I think they're too stupid to continue. I mean that. I mean, that's rude, but like the Legionnaires are too stupid to continue if they can't see why they can't use their founders' writings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Jean Vanier, though, I feel like there's more separation maybe than the Legionaries have. Like, it's like there's this ministry, and then there's this like other, like the writings.
It's also not a religious order, which is a huge difference. It's not a religious
order, right? And people can come and go.
Difference. Yeah. People aren't there their whole lives, and they're not,
right.
Leaving L'Arche is not as big a deal as leaving, or being a priest of a religious order or something. So,
right.
But like let's say with the Legionnaires, it's not my style the way they operate kind of militaristically on purpose. That's why they're called the Legionnaires, That's not my style, but maybe there's room for the church for a religious order that's a little bit like has a military theme,
Yeah.
So let's figure out what the most core things were about the Legionnaires. If you can't sort the good and the bad like that, I don't know how you should be spiritually leading anyone else. So to me, this has to be a doable project to sort all this stuff,
Yeah.
And you do need an outsider too. It can't be the order. I mean, obviously the order was duped at some serious level.
Well, I think one problem with the Legionaries is that there was like a lot of secrecy and like a sort of pyramid of secrecy that protected the founder, and it was, I think, probably written into the order, right? So
like the rules of the order and the way they handle information and the way they deal with cases all needs obviously changed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, to me, it's not that you have to, if that order's running like they're running a institute I can think of. It's not like necessarily that institute needs to close. It's not necessarily even true that institute needs given to another order necessarily.
Yeah.
But it needs rebranded. I feel like that's the
Yeah.
minimum, you know?
Yeah.
I think there has to be a sense in which this is a new day, right? Like the same, like Institute Incarnate Word. We've both liked some of what they did.
Yeah. Even I would
there's
say
not-
a lot. Yeah.
But there's also was a lot of like weird unity of thought, a lot of not free speaking, a lot of like collegiality needed to be in there a lot better. You know what I mean? They needed to hear objections better, discuss things openly better. They needed a big change, right? If they went from wearing their blue habit to wearing a whatever other color habit, it would be like, it's a new day.
Yeah. It
We're
would.
not operating like this anymore. We have a
Yeah.
clean break from the past. You know, we aren't allowed to cite these old things written by the founder who we know shouldn't be spiritually leading people.
Yeah.
We now have this new thing we're trusting in that, you know, a Pope's representative and somebody we trust all, you know, mutually collaborated on. You know, let's go.
Yeah.
We now got a free start. We're going to say our founder is this person who we trusted to collaborate with the papal representative. Let's go. We don't have to apologize all the time. We don't have to feel weird about it all the time. You know, because certainly their founder even chose their habit. And not that there's a corruption in the choice of habit, but like everything's pointing back to the founder at some level. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it just needs purged.
Yeah.
There's a huge room for discussion here, and I wonder how many people who are listening would like to comment.
Right.
Like, I would be interested in hearing everyone else's comments, but because Laura and I have kind of reached an impasse even before this podcast on our thoughts on this. So, okay. I think, what are we unified for? You had a few marks of what the problems are. You want to read those out or summarize that?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So a lot of times there might be a very charismatic founder or leader, and this charismatic person there's like a few things. They have reasons why they have enemies in the church, or they're being persecuted, or, you know, they are misunderstood. And so anytime anybody brings up anything bad, it's because the world hates holiness. And therefore you hate holiness too. Another thing is like they might have special rules applying to them, like why they can travel in a way that nobody else can, or they have special access to whatever. This by itself is not, but when you see like someone is very charismatic and has sort of a cult of personality, like a following, I think there are other people that have followings that I don't think it's bad. Like, I hate to even bring up his name in this like context, but like Bishop Barron has a lot of people that like listening to him, but if it's combined with these other characteristics, then this is what cult of personality is.
Sure. Like, not every charismatic figure is bad, but if a charismatic figure has these other warning signs, here's when it's bad. Okay, go for it.
So if there's secrecy in the order, with the institute, there is secrecy like in discerning with them. Like, you shouldn't talk to your family about it because they will try to dissuade you. And that is true for some people, but not, you know, and you should only talk to, you know, a spiritual director from our order, and you shouldn't talk to, you know, this and, you know, so it's like cut off everybody that had ever given you good advice ever and only talk to our people. Also, with discernment, you know, there's like guilt tripping, there's like a lack of freedom, and it's like, oh, it's like you can't choose this because, you know, some kind of personal flaw or weakness or lack of holiness or whatever, and that's just, you know, your relativistic whatever view, and you can't say yes to this thing. And that's not a healthy spirituality or how God moves people in our understanding, and a healthy understanding of spirituality. Like, God is not guilting you, you know. Another thing which you brought up was like weird unity of thought or very black and white thinking.
I think unity of thought's a very interesting idea, because it's like, we were discussing marks of a cult a while back, and it was like one of the people who'd come out of a cult said, unity of thought requires an incredible amount of energy.
Yeah.
Like, to maintain, to keep the group going with, you know, it has to be closed. You need, you have to like put in effort to keep everyone on the same page all the time, right? And there's something about truth that's like, truth's not afraid of freedom. It's not afraid of dissent. It's not afraid of conversation. Right. It's just not, it doesn't require that type of energy to uphold truth. Yeah. You know, like if you just love truth, and also it's not afraid of like with the Catholic idea, it's like, here are the basic ideas of the Catholic Church, and then there's a freedom within that to kind of be all different directions a little bit.
Right.
You know, but there's some unity at the top, but there's a lot of diversity in the church also.
Yes, and I'm wondering if there's like a better word, because you do want some like unity of thought, in the sense of like you're exploring these ideas and you're all sort of like mulling over the same thing and working on the same project, like you but when it's like you're allowed to say certain things and not say certain others, or it's like a faux pas, or you don't understand if you don't say the right thing, that's not really like unity of thought in the sense.
There was a priest that I knew, didn't know him well or anything, but like I know of no scandal on this guy. As far as I know, this guy was the best priest ever, right? But what always rubbed me wrong was like he had some people who were really devoted to him, and whenever his name was mentioned, they'd be like, "He's so holy, he's so great," and then somebody else in the conversation, "He's so great." And what it's kind of weird is like, is they're inadvertently warning you, do not speak bad about him in front of me.
Right.
Do not bring up an issue. Do not accuse. Do not they're kind of controlling the conversation.
And and the narrative, the story about this priest. Yeah.
But they're doing it. Yeah. They're not just telling you the story of the priest. They're not telling you their opinion necessarily. They're not even telling you why they think he's holy. It's just like a warning shot in the conversation. Like, you could be disruptive or alienated from me if you say anything that contradicts that. I just announced he's holy.
Yeah.
It's not like, he did this great thing that moved me or helped my family. There's none of that. It was just, he's greatly holy. And I always felt like something's wrong with this guy. I know of nothing wrong with that guy. I still know nothing. That guy's now deceased, but it's like, I as far as I know, he's the best ever, but it always made me think there was something wrong the way they were talking.
I think part of what bothered you about it is that this priest had a lot of people that spoke that way, and you couldn't have announced in a room, "He rubs me the wrong way," without people going nuts.
I would have been like that woman at the Institute of Incarnate Word who said that cardinal law being there was a bunch of crap. You know what I mean? Like they all would have been like, are we going to crucify Clark now for saying that? Or like, it's like, there just was no discuss. I mean, and really I wouldn't have said an accusation. He, as far as I know, has nothing wrong with him. I would just said, hey, he's not my style.
Yeah.
Or I like this other priest. I mean, you're supposed to have a popularity contest with priests, but it was just really, it felt constrictive.
Yeah. And if you say this person is not my cup of tea, and people are like, why? And
it's like, and really it should be the other way. It's like, you should say why you think this person is so holy and why you have to proclaim him holy every time you talk.
Yeah, because that's like a weird thing to do.
The evidence is not on me, like the proof of, it's really on you to always be proclaiming this, to be giving me stories and, of why you really think this. But anyway, I think we did a pretty good job. I'm sorry, anybody, if you thought that was long or we wandered too much, but let me just recap it again. Make sure we feel good about it. Boston scandal, 2002, certain priests go down, 50 years of stories come out of the closet. It shakes the nation. It's actually a nationwide scandal. There's many causes that we went over that I can't recap real quickly. And many reforms come out to where we're handling it differently for the last 20 years. We're going to have to go into, was there anything new in the Pennsylvania crisis that happened? I'm not sure that there was, but we're going to have to do a separate podcast on that. Then we talked about false accusations, how that is a real issue. And then we also have to talk about how there are these other church groups that aren't formally part of the church that have problems. They're going to continue. There will continue to be problems in the church. There will continue to be priests who do bad things, that something needs to happen to correct it. There also will be organizations of Catholics who act like cults. You know what I mean? And we need to trip them up somehow. Keep your friends out of them and keep yourself out of them. Anything else you want to say in conclusion?
Do you want to talk about our patron saints, Clark?
I think what's interesting, thank you for bringing that up, is that St. Francis founded an order, and he died fairly young, and he also left the order by the end. And there's just something about that makes you think it couldn't have been that cultish. He couldn't have been after all the power if he was trying to leave the order by the end, And St. Alphonsus had this other problem where he was trying to take the order he founded, the Redemptorists, also one of the top largest 5 male religious orders even today, although not that many people know St. Alphonsus Liguori, but like the top people in his order went to the Pope and were like, St. Alphonsus is crazy, you need to kick him out of the Redemptorists, right? So you see there wasn't blind devotion in those groups for their founders.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or the founders, and And St. Alphonsus eventually got let back in the order when the Pope realized that he'd kind of let a coup evolve. But
Yeah.
I've always thought it was funny that I'm still waiting that to happen to me. I'm sure it's going to happen at some point.
Get ready.
Yeah. It's weird how your perspective changes when you start meditating on this and what it means about man and sin and the need for forgiveness and how hard it is to get humans together to do a good work and do good.
Right.
You know? Not trivial at all.
Yeah, right.
So, anyway. All right, well,
Let's
good to see you, Laura.
You too?
All right, God bless. Talk to you later.
All right.